Oh, already.
It's recording now.
Cool. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second session of the privilege series. My name is Nicole. I am the host today. I won't be speaking much today. Mostly it will be Cat who will be introducing herself in the next slide. But to give everyone an overview of this series, last time we learned about systematic racism, and today we're learning more about what privileges are, how to unpack privilege, and how to promote equity. So I will, before I hand over the mic to Kat, I'm going to introduce the organizer, the Society of Heart Delights. I am encouraging everyone to follow the social media accounts because they do have really good content in Instagram, Facebook, YouTube channel, and WeChat account. So yeah, I highly recommend the content there, and I'm sure that everyone will learn a lot from reading the content. And lastly, today's session will be recorded and posted to the YouTube channel later. We do encourage everyone to turn on your camera. That way we can interact with you better. And we also encourage everyone to leave comments and also respond to to Kat's questions throughout the session. So now Kat will be talking about 30 minutes, sharing her experience and perspectives on privileges, and then we will start the Q&A for about 15-20 minutes.
Thank you so much for that, Nicole. 晚安，我的名字是谢婉莹，otherwise as Nicole said，我的名字是 Catherine Shieh。然后今天我们会讲 privilege，对不起，我的国语蛮烂，可是今天 we're going to be talking about privilege. And because we talked about race, we will be talking about other identities in the future, like what does it mean to be an immigrant? What does it mean to be LGBTQ, right? Men and women and non-binary and trans folks. We'll be talking about a lot of different parts of ourselves throughout the four sessions that we have together. So with that being said, I'm really excited for us to be able to talk about this. 我以前有教书, and this is exactly the kind of stuff that I actually taught in a high school setting. I used to teach in Los Angeles. As you can see here, I also used to work on anti-Asian violence webinars and trainings. I've also worked in politics. There's a lot of things that I've done, but it's really all trying to be a part of making the world a better place. 所以我有说我以前教书 something that I do want you to know, I always want to make sure we are very interactive. 不只是听我，你是要写，你是要念。So I very much encourage you, as Nicole said, when I ask questions, type your answers in the chat, and then it's my job to make sure that I'm like elevating and being able to answer questions. So with all of that, I have a few mini lessons about privilege. Privilege is something that I think a lot of people think they know about. We hear it a lot, right? We'll hear like, it's a privilege to be a white person. It's a privilege to be rich. It's a privilege to be a citizen, right? And I just want to be very clear about what is privilege and what it is not, because I think a lot of times it gets misunderstood. The first is privilege is really the ability to be able to have power, the ability to have choices, right? So like, for example, when people say it's a privilege to be a man, right? How much power, how much choice does someone have because they're a man? Maybe they don't have to think about safety the same way as a woman. Maybe they can think about the choices and the power to be able to think about their careers in ways that, you know, a woman may not, right? Like, so thinking about how much power and ability to make choices, that's a part of privilege, right? So for example, for myself, I think it's a privilege to go to college because my choices become a lot more choices. The choices to make certain amounts of money, the choice to be able to change jobs, the choices to be able to network with different kinds of people, right? Ability to have more power, more choice. I want to really think about the second and the third bullet point here. A lot of people think that you control your own privilege. And this is the part where I say, not really as much. So, for example, when someone says, oh, well, it's a privilege to be straight, right? A straight person. Well, people don't wake up and say, I think I'm going to be a straight person and like walk down the street, right? People don't wake up one day and say, oh, well, I think it's going to be my choice to be gay or lesbian, right? Like it's not really within our control. Maybe we realize certain parts of ourselves, but we don't decide that we want to be an undocumented person. We don't decide that like, oh, I guess I just won't go to college because I don't feel like it, right? Like how many choices do we get to be able to get to a certain place where we can have more power, right? This is a little bit tricky because some people think that, well, if it's a privilege to be rich, I can control how rich I am. Well, it's a privilege to be a citizen. I get to decide whether or not I'm a citizen. And this is the part where I say that's actually not completely true, right? A government decides whether or not you get citizenship. It's not a matter of how badly you want to be a citizen. Sometimes that's not really within our control. There are laws that limit us from that. Or when someone says, you know, it's a privilege to be rich, I get to decide who's rich. Actually, that's not totally true. A lot of that might have to do with your immigration visa that allows you to go to school, so then you can make money. Or maybe it's the right person who thought you were good for a high-paying job, and therefore, right, like it's not totally within our control of like, oh, I've decided I'm going to be rich and therefore I'm going to go, right? It's not necessary. It's not totally within our control. Something I want to really be able to say is, as you can see here, privilege is not really a choice, but what we choose to do with it is, right? So I know I was able to go to college not simply because I wanted it badly enough, it's because my parents, right, have the ability to afford it. They have the power and they have the choice for me to be able to pursue that. Having a privilege to go to college, privilege is not necessarily a bad thing. Ignoring privilege, I don't think that's great. Hiding privilege, also don't think that's really great. Right? So if someone is rich, it's not really their fault. It's not really in their control. What they choose to do with how rich they are, I think that determines whether things are bad or good. Having a college degree, that privilege is it's not really about bad or good. It's what I choose to do with my college degree or my graduate school degree that counts. It's not a good or bad thing that I'm a citizen of the United States. How I choose to use that privilege determines the good and the bad. We can't really control who we are, and we are not always in full control of the circumstances and the situations that we're in. How we choose to use the situations we're given is really important for us. Something that I'm going to say right here on the bottom is everyone has some type of privilege. You might not always know or realize it. Everyone has it. I've already listed out mine several times. I'm going to put mine in the chat. And again, it's like, don't hide it. Like we all have it. It's not about good or bad. We just have privileges. We all do. What we choose to do with it is another thing. And that's the point of this session, right? So what I'm going to ask you all to do is you're going to place into the chat, what kind of privileges do you think you have? And again, I'm going to put it in the chat. I'm going to ask you to do so too. I'll give us about like 20 seconds to type it in, and then I'll talk about it a little bit. As you can see, I put in another privilege that I have. I encourage you all to do the same. I'll give us about 15 more seconds. Okay. I am straight. Right. Raised in a big city, for sure. Right. It's not a good or bad thing. They just happen. It's the reality. It's the world that we live in, that we're not given equal choices, right? Thank you very much for sharing all these things, right? And so again, what we choose to do with these things, how much we acknowledge, how much it actually gives us choice and power, those are important. How do we kind of like spread, how do we like spread that around to make sure that we do good for not only ourselves, but for others as well, right? I have choice. Is that also a privilege? That is a good question. So here's the thing. Choice in what though, Nicole? That becomes the question. Choice in like safety, choice in jobs, choice in where you move to, right? Yeah, someone even said like born and raised in a big city, right? Like how does that become a privilege? You have the choices to be able to be in a variety of different contexts, right? You can be like a very flexible person in some ways. So Nicole, just wanting to answer your question, a choice in what were you thinking about? And you can either type it in or you can just get off mute. That's up to you.
I'll type it in.
Okay, yeah, that's totally fine. If anything, that's good for people to read anyways. Yeah, it's always important to think choice in what. Something, right? Like being straight sometimes means you have a wider choice in having friends, right? That's important to think about. I said language privilege, right? I didn't wake up, at like 2 years old and say, I decide that I want to learn English, right? Like there are situations that were placed on me that made me this way, right? Having a graduate degree, for sure. Like how much is like, oh, people take Laura more seriously now, right? So it's not just about jobs. It's not just about like money, but it's also like how people view you. You have a graduate degree. You're worthy of respect, right? I'm not saying that's like always the case. Sometimes it depends on what you study, but there is something to be said there, right? And then I think we're just going to wait on Nicole, and then I think we're good to go. And then Laura, great to have you back.
Oh, thank you.
Choice and not being discriminated, having more opportunities. Yeah, I would even argue, get even more specific than that. What kinds of opportunities? Are you talking about like friends opportunities? Are you talking about job opportunities? Are you talking about school opportunities? Are you talking about where you live opportunities? You see where I'm getting at here? Then it kind of helps you think about what kinds of privileges you have. And also, actually, maybe you don't have opportunities in certain ways, right? So I think that that's also important to share. Nicole, what do you think about what I said? Is there any other questions you have, or does that kind of answer your question?
I just went off mute again. Yeah, I think it's easier to do it this way versus putting into the chat box. I think you definitely answered my question in a way. I was also thinking, you know, I do realize that I have a lot of other privileges too. How does that intersect with this being straight privilege?
Yeah, you know what? I'm not going to answer your question because it's in the next slide. But yeah, you're totally right. We're not only talking about one privilege. I just asked you to list one, but Nicole, you're totally right. We have more than one privilege. We have more than one identity. And so with that, what happens when they all come together? Right. And that's sometimes like a little bit on the trickier side, right? Like I'm an Asian American from the Bay Area. That affords me a lot of privileges. But being a woman and looking LGBTQ might mean like a little bit less. But then also like being like a smaller or shorter person might mean a little less. But then also being rich might mean a little more, right? Like it's kind of weird to like, where do we put ourselves when we have a lot of different intersecting identities, right? So I'm really glad that you shared that. Right. So just to like recap this, as you can see, these are some examples of the kinds of privileges that might show up, right? And based off of what kind of Nicole had said of like what happens when you have multiple privileges and they intersect, what I put here on the right-hand side of this is privilege can come up depending on the situation, and it is almost never in your control. When I'm in the Bay Area, I feel a lot safer in a lot of ways because I'm around Asians. In Chicago, sometimes I feel a little less safe. When I'm in Indiana, I definitely don't feel safe because I'm Asian, right? Like, do you see how the privilege kind of changes depending on where I am? When I'm in California, the fact that I have short hair doesn't seem to bother people. Right. So that's where like being LGBTQ or looking LGBTQ in my situation, I don't really think about straight privilege or LGBTQ privilege as much. But when I travel in Florida, oh, I think about it a lot. I think about it all the time, right? It really sometimes depends on the situation that we're in. And so it's not always about like, I have privilege. Sometimes it kind of just depends on where you are, what the circumstances, what's the situation at hand here. And remember, the situations are not always really in our control. We didn't choose to be born. I didn't choose to be born in Mountain View, right? There are situations beyond our control. And it's, again, important not to hide it. It just is, right? And so sometimes these things kind of intersect. This is what I like to think about, because sometimes privilege, as I said, if it's dependent on situation, then it can be very confusing. So this is the question I ask myself all the time. And it actually helps me understand what kind of privilege I have and how I talk about privilege to other people and how I also figure out what are other people's privileges. Whatever situation I'm in, as you can see in the bold, whatever situation I'm in, what is the worst possible thing that could happen given X identity, given whatever identity, right? So, for example, let's say I'm driving a car, and let's say I don't have a green card. I'm an undocumented person. I'm technically like not legal to be here in the United States. Let's say I'm driving a car. This sort of driving privilege, like being in the United States, there's sort of privilege in that sense, but like there's not the privilege of being a citizen. What's the worst possible thing that could happen because I'm an undocumented driver, car driver? Can someone write into the chat, what's the worst possible situation that could happen? Again, it's not guaranteed. We just don't know, but it's a possibility. What's the worst possible thing that could happen because I'm driving a car and I'm undocumented? Place it into the chat. Let's see what comes up for us. Deportation. Yeah, right. Again, like, did I say this is totally gonna happen? No. Is it a possibility? Yeah. I'm a citizen. What's the worst possible thing that could happen to me as a person who's driving a car, but I'm a citizen? What's the worst possible thing that could happen to me? Place it into the chat. A ticket. Do you see the difference here? This is not a funny situation. But you do realize in what ways it's kind of funny how different the possible outcomes could be. At the end of the day, does a ticket suck? Yes. Then we can also talk about like class privilege and like money privilege and socioeconomic, like we can also talk about that, like, right? Kind of like what Nicole was saying, like you start to see how these privileges can sometimes bleed into each other. Again, this is the question I oftentimes ask myself when I feel like my life sucks, or when I feel like someone else's life sucks, or maybe I'm not really sure how to talk about privilege. I think to myself, what's the worst possible thing that could happen? And so sometimes when I think about, let's say, the uprisings of 2020, or we think about Black Lives Matter, what's the worst possible thing that could happen walking on the street if you are Black? You quite literally die. What's the worst possible thing that could happen to me as an English-speaking Asian American? I don't know, but I know it's not death. You see how different these privileges are. Again, I'm not trying to say this is good or bad. I did not, just like you, I did not decide that I wanted to be Asian. It's a situation beyond my control. But to deny the fact that I have privileges in some ways, and in this particular case, it's race, to deny that privilege, to not acknowledge it, to hide it, that becomes the problem. In the next coming slides, I'll talk about like, what does it mean to use your privilege? You have it. You didn't ask for it, so you might as well use it. So, with all that said, this is just a big chart that I want you to look over, and you're going to put it into the chat. You're going to read it row by row. What kinds of privileges do you personally think about a lot? Which privileges do you like never think about until you saw this chart? So you're going to place two answers. What privileges? Oh, wow. Celebration. What privileges do you think about a lot? Place it into the chat. What privileges do you like literally never think about until you saw this chart? You're going to place it into the chat. I see some people like literally get into this screen. Let's see what let's see what we have here. And I'll place my answers too. And Wen, thank you very much for the encouragement, participating into the chat. I appreciate that. So I told you what I rarely think about. I told you what I think about a lot. Thank you for that one. Yeah, rarely thinking about military service. And I think it's always really important to like think about, again, in what ways do these privileges kind of intersect, right? A lot of benefits about military service happen to white veterans, but not necessarily veterans of color, right? Many women veterans get mistreated, right? And so always important to also think about some of those intersections because those are very real. Or even the fact that like the military literally did not allow gay people for like 30 years and it was like signed into law, right? Like, so obviously like there's lots of things to intersect here. So thank you for that. Thank you for that one. So rarely think about military service. What do you think about a lot? What do you not think about? Place it into the chat. I'll give us like 20 more seconds. I'd love to see some other answers. There's like 10 more seconds. Ooh, thank you, Laura. You think a lot about gender and immigration status. Something that I really want to like make sure that we acknowledge. We oftentimes think about our own identities in relation to privilege, right? And then how do we stretch ourselves to also think about the identities we don't really have ourselves, right? Okay, you think a lot about racial, gender, and sexual orientation. Yep, very much so, right? And again, maybe sometimes that kind of changes a little bit depending on the situation, right? And also thinking about the fact that some of us carry multiple identities, so we're like always worried about so much, literally all the time, right? How tiring that is all the time. Think about a lot. Thank you, Nicole. Class, sexual orientation, rank and status, language, ability. Okay, so you think about a lot of things. Great. Ability and immigration, rarely thinking about age and youth. Totally. And how does that change like people's positions to power? Remember, power and choice, right? Again, the reason why I ask you to think about what you know a lot about and what you never think about obviously your own orientations. Try to stretch yourself to think about other people that you might not be necessarily similar or the same with, right? So you'll get these slides, so you'll get to look at this again, but this wheel right here is actually just a different form of this chart, right? As you can see, identities, who's like in power, who's not in power, generally, same thing, right? Those closest to power and choice and privilege, people who have houses, people who are not transgender, people who are citizens, right? Like thinking about that, right? And then who has like less power, who's away from that center of the circle. Again, this wheel, just a different form of this, if that helps. So what I'm going to ask you is this. In what ways do you have privilege? We've actually already listed that out. And so I want you to think about how this might be different than before. And when I say before, I think about like before you took this session today, right? How you thought about privilege before 7 p.m. tonight. And in what ways are you thinking about it differently? This is how I want you to think about it. You have privilege. I have privilege. It's a fact. We're not going to deny it. So you have it. What are you going to do with it? And what are you not going to do with it? All right. And this is the part that actually makes a lot of people really uncomfortable. Because in America, in places in which we have capitalist societies, who do we think about the most? Ourselves, our own families. So we think about how much we need to preserve ourselves, how much we need to do better. But at the cost of who else? At the cost of who do you hurt? Right? Because I had thought so much about being rich, being in the tech sector, going into a good school in the Bay Area, because I got to think about all those privileges all of the time being in the Bay Area, who was that at the cost of? And the uncomfortable fact is, it's a lot of poor, Black, Latina, Southeast Asian people who live in the Bay Area who don't have those same chances. But because so many people from Cupertino, where I'm from, are so obsessed with a good school, they'll do anything to make sure that their kids do not go to school with Southeast Asian kids, will not go to school with Latina kids, will not go to school with Black kids, right? Like the privilege comes at the cost of what, right? And so my question then becomes, what do you do with your privilege? There are some uncomfortable truths here that you're going to have to type in. And what do you not do with that privilege? So for example, for myself, and again, do you have to do the same choices? No, we're all different people, but you do need to think about this. Because I had these privileges, what did I end up doing with this? For me, I really wanted it to be my day job. I wanted to teach kids who were not Asian on purpose. And of the Asian kids that I did teach, I wanted to make sure that they weren't East Asian. that they were South Asian, that they were Southeast Asian, they were the more disadvantaged Asian Americans in this country that I think were worth getting a really good education. So that's why I became a teacher. I decided to make that my day job. Some people don't do that, and that's fine. Maybe it means that you have the privilege. Now you need to go volunteer. Maybe it means now you need to be on the board of a nonprofit. Maybe you need to help fundraise. Maybe this means that you're going to start a volunteering or a social justice group at your company. I don't know what that means. It's going to mean something different for everyone. Or maybe it means that you choose to send your kid to Fremont High School instead of Monte Vista, right? Like, who knows what this is going to look like for you? These two are hard questions, so I'm going to give us a minute to think about it. You have privileges. What do you do with it? What do you not do with it? So what I'm going to ask you to do, think about it. You're going to put these two answers into the chat. And like I said, I'm going to do the same thing. Let's have a minute to think and type. I placed mine into the chat. As you can see, I stated like a privilege and then figured out, what do I want to do? What do I not want to do? Hopefully that helps give you sort of like a skeleton to think about this.
Hey, Kat, should we give people more time? Because when we write in English, it takes more time.
Yeah, that sounds good. All right, sounds good. It's 10:30, it's 7:39 right now. Let's say until how about 7:41, 7:42? Sounds good. Okay, yeah. Instead of a minute, we'll have like closer to 3 minutes. Sorry about that. Thank you. If you all also prefer to type in pinyin and then just like, I can't read or write, but like just verbally translate, I can also do that.
Yeah, I can also help translate if that's easier for anyone.
Yeah, Nicole, it definitely sounds like maybe you weren't thinking about a specific privilege, but just saying like everyone has privilege, right? Um, just so you know, as you can probably tell, I try to talk about privilege in a very neutral way, right? Of just like, you have privilege, right? Like, or like, you have privilege, right? Like, just you have privilege. We all have it, right? Very much so. Encourage conversations so people can hear other people's privileges. Yeah, you know, honestly, sometimes it's really nice to, when I like talk to other people my age and be like, oh my God, how'd you get that house? Like, I want to figure out how to buy a house. How do you save up for, like, save up to buy a house? And then some people are like, oh, my parents bought it. Sometimes I'm like, oh, that actually makes me feel better. That is not like me being bad at saving, right? Like, so sometimes it's because sometimes it kind of depends on the way that we take the conversation, right? But just being transparent about it. So we know that people are, you know, someone said to me the other day, like a baseball game, some people start at first base, some people start life at third base. Just being able to talk about that can be really helpful. You know, get to know underprivileged people, help amplify their voices, right? Like, in what ways can we center, right, in capitalist systems where we're supposed to do well and be educated and be rich? How can we like actually spend a little time maybe not being so self-obsessed and maybe centering other people or building communities like Society of Heart's Delight? So we're thinking about people as a group, we're thinking about community. So we're taking care of each other rather than trying to scramble to always take care of ourselves, right? Even though I'm not Muslim, we can try to talk about how we can't equate terrorists with Muslims, right? And that becomes especially important in today's day and age about foreign policy, the war in the Middle East, things like that, helping people, not hurting people. Use privilege to not help people, but not take advantage of others. I'm really excited about that, right? Because you also have to be really careful about privilege, right? Because like sometimes people, they call it the savior complex, right? Some people with privilege quite literally act like they're Jesus here to save folks. Right. And Yanling, I think you really come up with something, right? Like, don't take advantage of others. It's not for your own benefit. It's not to make you feel like you deserve an award or a prize or like a documentary made off of you on how you're a hero. You got to be kind of careful about that, right? Use your privilege to help folks who don't have as much privilege, but like, don't make it about you. I'm from a big city. I want to donate to funds that help improve educational equality in remote villages. Very much so. Don't ignore and do nothing. Very much so. Right. So some people like said, have conversations. Some people said, like, be around other people. Some people said, use money. Do you see how we all have different solutions? Because we're all different people. We all have our own style on how do we want to make a positive impact. Right. So again, very much going back, I'm just going to keep going back to what Nicole said. We have lots of different types of privileges. So that means not only is there a lot for you to think about, but there also means that there's lots of different ways. Yay! There's lots of different ways to be able to make a difference. So with that being said, I actually don't think I really need this particular slide because I think we kind of went over this. I think you all learned quite fast, right? Like in what ways we can use our privilege. You came up with an example. And something I do want to mention on this slide, though, is at the on the very bottom, it says, you use your privilege even when you're scared. Some people think they might be shamed for being from a big city. Some people are afraid they'll be shamed because they're Christian, because they have power and agency and choice. Maybe they're afraid that it's going to sound like they're bragging that they're straight. Sometimes it's scary. Sometimes it's scary to say that you don't have privilege and people think you didn't work hard to get money, that you didn't work hard to go to college. You didn't work hard to go to a graduate degree. You didn't work hard to become a citizen. You didn't work hard enough to be able to afford to live in the Bay Area, right? It can be scary to talk about these things. What I often like to say is this: even when you are scared to talk about privilege when you do have it and when you don't, You find your friends and supporters really easily during scary times like these. And you will realize that you are not the only one. Even though you'll feel lonely, you're not the only one who's thinking and feeling all these things. And the last thing, even when it is scary, to use your privilege. Maybe you don't see the results immediately. Sometimes it takes a little while for people to learn these lessons. But when people come around and realize that you're right about all this and that it was actually kind of nice that you talked about it and really nice that you fought for people, you'll realize that over time, a lot of these conversations, they're actually kind of relaxing. They're relieving. We don't have to hide our stress anymore. It takes a while, but we can get there. With all that said, again, you will get these slides at the end of the 4 sessions that we have together. But these are some of the resources that I've used. As you can tell, I've also used lots of diagrams and pictures. But otherwise, that's actually all I had for us. I know that I only had about 30 minutes-ish of content, but otherwise I'm here to be able to talk about things, questions you have, stories you want to share. This is really our time together. We have about 12 minutes to be able to talk about whatever we think is important to talk about in regards to privilege. So with that, thank you all.
Thank you, Kat, for this wonderful presentation and really thought-provoking. I don't know if I should use my privilege as the host to ask questions first. Anyone with questions, please feel free to type it in the chat box. Or can we ask them to unmute themselves? Oh, yeah. So either chat box or unmuting yourself.
Yep, totally. And then English or Chinese, it doesn't really matter. We will figure it out.
So I do have a question, and so I don't know, because I realize I have privileges, and some of my friends they do, but a lot of time they don't aware of that, or they don't admit to that. I don't know how to bring up this kind of issue with them without breaking the friendship, because sometimes I can see that you can easily get into like heated discussion or arguments because they are not aware. They don't think they have a privilege as being white or as being straight, and all sorts of these things. Just curious how to bring up this kind of issue with them in a nice way.
What you're saying is very real, right?
Mhm.
There are some things to remember. The first is we have this session about privilege because we live in a world that is unwilling to talk about it. And so if they're not willing to talk about it, that just means they live in this world. Right? So know that it's not just you. Always good to remember that. Doesn't mean it's not worth trying, but just know that it's like there's a lot of forces. There's a lot of incentives to not be able to think about it. So there's that. Always good to remind. The second thing is, I think you've actually seen me already do this in the session. You saw me talk about mine first. So oftentimes, right, like in teaching, I'll model it first. So I'll talk about it and then kind of be like, is there anything that you think is like kind of similar for you? Right. And then sometimes people can connect. Does this work 100% of the time? Obviously not. Is it a type of style I personally use? Yes, it is. So you saw me do that. Like I talk about myself first rather than just talking about someone else's, because I'm not that. And then the last thing that I really want you to think about is another thing that I also did. Why are people so afraid to talk about privilege? Because they think it's a judgment about them. Nicole, I can't believe you're rich. Right? Like that's how we talk about privilege. We talk about it like it's your fault. We talk about it like you're a bad person. Oh, Nicole, why did you choose to be poor? Right? It's always in the concept of approval and disapproval. How can we reverse that? And so, as you can see, what I do is I don't shame the person for not having privilege. I don't shame the person for having privilege. I shame them for the choices they do with it. I don't shame the person. Let's talk about the action, right? So it's like, yeah, when you're from a big city, you get to have all the food in the world at your feet. You didn't ask for that. You weren't like born out of the womb and said, this is my choice, right? Whatever. What you choose to do with that, how you want to talk about it, now that you know more, you have that power to be able to change that, right? And what you're doing is you're actually encouraging your friends to actively choose that for themselves too, to help make the world a better place. And then here's the worst part of it all. If your friends are still actively choosing not to make the world a better place, even though you're giving them a positive choice to do so, I think you need better friends and we can help you find that.
I totally agree.
Hopefully Society of Heart's Delight can help, and it can help build groups like this, right? But they are products of their own environment, just like we are, you know. And sometimes I get really frustrated too, and then I have to remember that I'm a Californian and I lived in a state that allows me to talk about these things. Because I know in Missouri, right next to Illinois, in Missouri, they don't allow you to talk about these things. And that's the privilege I have to reckon with too. Even though I kind of want to punch everybody in the face sometimes, like, but like just remembering where people are coming from can be really tough.
Yeah, absolutely. Living in California, I do feel like we're living in a bubble. And when we go out to other states like Missouri and in the South, yeah, they don't have the same, especially like LGBTQ, community.
Yeah.
It's tough for them.
Very much so. And by the way, like as you share that, I also don't want to ignore the fact that like California is not heaven. It is not a dream world. Right? Like there's still homophobia. There is still xenophobia. There's all these phobias still. Yeah. In many ways, we're lucky. In many ways, like we have so much more to go. Totally. Thank you very much for sharing that, Wen. I appreciate that a lot because I bet you everybody is secretly thinking that question anyways. How in the world do I talk to somebody about this? Yeah. Nicole, you mentioned your privileges put you, sometimes your privileges put you at a disadvantaged position. What's the difference between that and feeling underprivileged? This goes back to my question. What's the worst possible thing that could happen? Right? In a given situation with a particular identity. And if the answer is like what Laura said, if the answer is deportation, yeah, you're pretty underprivileged. Right? What's the worst possible thing that could happen if I don't have a college degree? Nicole, can you come up with an answer? What's the worst possible thing that could happen if I don't have a college degree?
Is it a question for me?
Yeah.
What my parents would fund me to study in China.
Okay, so you like quite literally have to like move. What else could be a possibility? And maybe not just you, but just anybody. What's the worst possible situation that could happen if you don't have a college degree?
Well, I guess you have to start working at a really early age.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to afford your bills, you have to afford rent, all of that.
Right. And like most likely with multiple jobs too, not just one.
Yes, because it's hard for you to get a job if you don't have a college degree.
And also a lot of those jobs don't have protections. There's a lot of abuse by your employer. So you start to see the worst possible outcome. So let's say you have a college degree. What's the worst possible outcome?
Well, are you asking what's the worst possible outcome of
having a college degree?
I think it's bringing all the advantages. I don't really.
Exactly my point.
Got it.
Exactly. However, I do want to say in this day and age, right? All those 5 things of not having a college degree, right? Like you get sent somewhere else, like you get shamed, like you have to work lots of jobs. Do those happen to people with college degrees? Yes. Sometimes. But do you also get all the advantages? Yeah. So therefore, you start to see what's the difference between having a bad day and not having a privilege. Does that answer your question, Nicole? Yeah. Again, the fact that you asked that is just a reminder that you kind of have to train your brain to think like this, especially since sometimes it's dependent on situation. Oh, and Wen, thank you very much for sharing the YouTube video. Does anyone else have any other questions or comments?
People might be processing what they're informed about today.
Yeah, and that would make sense.
Time.
Yeah, of course. I think these things always take a lot of time. I oftentimes like to say that I can't control how you understand these things completely, but I do have faith that 3 months from now, one of you is washing the dishes and then a light bulb goes off because your mind's been processing it this whole time. So I know that sometimes the learning is very immediate and sometimes it just kind of comes randomly and all the dots start connecting. So I also want to say that I know that sometimes it takes a little bit of time for us. And so we should be able to give that sort of grace and forgiveness for each other to know that the lessons will come in due time. So thanks for setting that up, Nicole. If that's everything, I just want to say, 真的谢谢你们. I'm very excited for the 3rd and the 4th session. When Nicole, 真的谢谢你, 你帮我. 所以, otherwise, 晚安和再见.
再见，谢谢。
好，谢谢。
Thanks everyone.